Welcome back. We are still in Washington, D.C. This is our final day of our trip. We'll be back in studio for an open line tomorrow, talk about some of the things that we have heard and discussed here in our nation's capital this week, and it'll be open for whatever you want to bring up as well on tomorrow's program. But today, we're very happy to be broadcasting from the Department of Education, and our next guest is someone who's helped put all this together for us, John White, Deputy Assistant Secretary for Rural Outreach. John, thank you for all your help and for hosting us here at the Department of Education.
Our pleasure. It's very important for us to communicate with folks across the country throughout communities in rural America as well as other areas.
Let's talk about No Child Left Behind. This has been a controversial program. There are strong feelings of both sides of it, whether it's working or not working, what's good, what's not so good about it. We know the president is pushing right now some proposals for some changes in No Child Left Behind. Kind of outline for us what the administration would like to see be the next step for this program.
So first of all, reauthorization of the law is long overdue. It was due to be reauthorized in 2007. So we really want to make some changes that change from a one-size-fits-all model to one that is more flexible, has more local control. We want to point out that No Child Left Behind did the nation a service when it really made children who were invisible visible and made us all accountable for their success. So disadvantaged children should be performing just as well and have just as good an education as anyone else. And what we need to do now is almost flip the model. So under No Child Left Behind, there was such a focus on testing of reading and math that the curriculum was narrowed, that in many states standards were dummied down. So fortunately, this has become a movement across states where most of the nation's governors have come together to form a consortium to raise standards, make them college and career ready so that when students graduate, they can either go to college without remediation or right into a job or a trade program. So by raising standards, whether or not a state adopts the Common Core that the governors have been bringing together or validates that their education is college and career ready according to their public university system, we'll know that we'll have higher, better career-ready standards for all students. And what we want to do is give schools more flexibility to innovate and help those students reach those higher standards, not tell them how to get there.
Because I know there has been some frustration with those in education that there hasn't been more flexibility and some things they've seen right in schools that could have been helpful that they couldn't do under the program. So you're wanting to give them more of that flexibility.
Absolutely. So if you think about rural schools and the challenges they face, in many cases it is a little more difficult to get teachers and principals in certain areas. So if you have a great math teacher who is also getting success in a science class, we don't want you to have to take that teacher out of that science class just because they're, according to a paper credentialing system, not highly qualified. We want to measure highly effectiveness. So if that's a highly effective teacher in that science class, we want to keep him there, support him, and bring more resources to bear for those students.
We're talking with John White, Deputy Assistant Secretary for Rural Outreach here at the Department of Education. What are your thoughts on charter schools? I mean, that's an issue throughout the country, and we're seeing it more and more in rural America. There's concerns about class sizes. There's concern about tight budgets and still being able to offer good programs and education for students in rural America. How do you view charter schools?
So charter schools are a great topic of discussion because the administration has invested heavily in allowing or having states allow charter schools or charter operators with the kind of authority of a performance contract. So what Secretary Duncan wants is more great schools. If a charter school is not performing, it should be shut down. If a traditional school needs support, it should get support. But what I would emphasize, particularly for rural communities, is look at the programs and funding that are available through the programs that we're proposing. It doesn't have to be a charter school. It could be an innovative traditional school. But even the charter model has shown that you can actually reinvent a school in a way that makes it more contextually relevant in a rural community. On our website, if you go to our blog, there's an example of this where the Walton Rural Early Rural Learning Center in Kansas. It's a middle school in Kansas. Used a federal charter school grant to incorporate a model where agriculture is incorporated in every subject and in every classroom. There are partnerships with family farms for every classroom. They have livestock, they grow vegetables, they even have a wind turbine on their property. So, students are learning math while they're putting together agriculture. They're learning about new technology with the wind turbine and renewable energy. They've found a way to use the charter school program or the funding for the charter school program to reinvent their curriculum, to reinvent their school, and actually to increase enrollment. Their school has increased since they reopened as a charter.
It's such a challenge right now because so many school districts are in a financial bind. How do you make ends meet and still offer the programs and the opportunities for students? I know you're looking at that, and especially in rural America where, distance it can be an issue, numbers can be certainly an issue. So that's a big challenge to try to still provide great education and opportunities for our young people.
Absolutely. So let me touch on two things. One is that we recognize charters aren't right for everyone. So it's a choice that people should have the right to make. Second, on funding, through reauthorization of the Elementary and Secondary Education Act, we would propose that we maintain the kind of critical formula funding dollars that are going to schools through Title I, through IDEA for special education students, but also there's a complementary program called the Rural Education Achievement Program for low income and for small rural schools. We want to maintain that funding and critical support for schools, plus use a smaller pot of discretionary funding we've been lucky to have proposed by the President for innovation. So we would hold competitions that would seek to identify the kind of innovative programs that are helping rural schools overcome some challenges related to distance and poverty. We want to provide targeted funding for those programs so that they can grow, develop, be replicated in other communities so we can learn from each other.
I know a concern in rural America for some of these competitive situations where schools compete with others for grants or funding or whatever it may be. There's a feeling that sometimes in rural America they don't have that same chance. They're not on an equal playing field as far as really being able to compete. How do you assure them that their chances are just as good as another?
So we've gone to great lengths to try to level that playing field in the last year or so. We've traveled, the Secretary of Education and his staff have covered all 50 states. We've also implemented measures to do exactly what you say, whether it's through a preference in a grant competition for rural schools, whether it's encouraging consortia of schools to work together with a lead sponsor, whether it's an education service agency, whether it's a local rural community college, a nonprofit. We've actually reached out to the philanthropic community as well, and they've responded in a big way. Under the Investing in Innovation Fund, the Kellogg Foundation, for example, has stepped up and provided a $1.4 million grant to the Rural School and Community Trust, a nonprofit who pulled together, I believe, over 1,000 rural schools and helped with on-the-ground grant writing, professional grant writing services so that we did have quality applicants and that we were able to target some programs that work in rural communities and fund them.
I mean, the bottom line for a lot of these schools, I mean, there can be great programs available to them, but if they can't keep the doors open, they're not going to be able to, give those to the kids. So that's really the challenge a lot of them face.
Absolutely, and if you notice from the President's budget proposal, education is one of the few federal agencies that was lucky enough in these difficult economic times to have a proposed increase because he recognizes that it's an investment. It's not really an expense, it's an investment in our future.
I guess the concern for a lot of smaller rural schools, will that money get to them or does it just immediately go to the bigger urban areas?
So obviously a lot of the programs come through the state, but formula programs are intended to support those needs. What we've done, especially with a popular program called Race to the Top, is recognizing that not every state participated, and we want to make sure that every school district does have access. The next round of Race to the Top would be a school district level competition, so all districts would have access. There will also be a rural carve-out, so rural schools would only be competing against one another, not big urban districts. And we hope to, again, find more ways to level the playing field and increase access.
That's interesting. Perhaps a lot of us didn't realize the focus on rural schools here at the Department of Education. It's good to hear that rural America is not forgotten in the total process here.
Not at all, because without rural America, the country can't move forward in a great way like we want it to.
John, thank you very much for the background and the information and for hosting us here. We appreciate it.
Our pleasure. Thank you.
All right. That is John White, Deputy Assistant Secretary for Rural Outreach here at the Department of Education. Well, we've covered a lot of ground. A lot of things are going on, obviously, a lot of technology, a lot of very important programs and efforts, as you just heard John explain, to level that playing field for access to the information and to funding for rural America as it competes with the bigger city schools and population centers. But a challenge, I think, for schools everywhere, and maybe even more so in rural America, and that is how do we get that next generation of teachers? How do we attract them? How do we keep people, good qualified teachers in this profession? We all know it's so critical for our children, our grandchildren, to have good teachers, to really get them off to a great start with their education. We're going to talk about that next. Stay with us. This is AgriTalk.